All matter has mental properties, they say, even atoms. Everything is conscious, at least to some degree. Italian philosopher Francesco Patrizzi called this view panpsychism. But even if we overlook this shortcoming, other problems still loom. Problems far too similar to ones we've already considered. For example, according to property dualism, mental properties are properties that physical things can have when they're properly complex, like brains. But just like other properties, mental properties cause things to happen in the physical world. Just like the mass of an atom can cause other atoms to move, so too can mental properties cause our bodies to move, say by changing the physical properties of our brain and thus making our neurons fire in a certain kind of way that would, move my arm. But how could a non-physical property change a physical property? One physical property, say mass, affecting another physical property, say location, well, that makes sense. Again, we can even explain this in terms of interactions with the Higgs field, with which both particles interact. But how could a non-physical mental property cause a change in a physical one? They're in two different realms. Are we going to have to hypothesize some kind of mental field with which only the physical and mental properties of brains can interact? While perhaps tempting, such a suggestion would seem just to be ad hoc. Why can only brains interact with this field? In fact, how could such interactions occur without violating the same constants and laws that the soul hypothesis and substance dualism violate? Recall the conservation of momentum and energy. Mental properties causing physical events would add energy and momentum into the system. Property dualism, it seems, fares no better than substance dualism when it comes to the problem of downwards causation. In fact, contemporary philosopher Susan Schneider has argued that there is no way to make sense of property dualism without appealing to some variety of substance dualism. Property dualism, it seems, is just substance dualism in disguise. This downfall of property dualism, however, is avoided by another theory of mind called epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism, which was defended early on by T.H. Huxley and more recently by philosophers like Frank Jackson, is not as concerned with answering the hard problem of consciousness, explaining why or how the mental emerges from the complex activity of the brain. In my experience, epiphenomenalists are comfortable with realizing that the mental does emerge from and is dependent upon the brain and just leaving it at that. But in an attempt to avoid the problem of downwards causation that plagues both property and substance dualism, the epiphenomenalist suggests that the mental is causally inert. Mentality does emerge from complex brain activity, a fact that is evident to all of us as we consider our own mental lives. But that mentality, mental properties or whatever you want to call it, doesn't actually do anything. So there's no need to account for how it's possible for something that is non-physical, like the mental, to cause something to happen in the physical world, because it doesn't. The mental has no causal efficacy. It is an epiphenomenon. It's just along for the ride. So, if we are looking for a causal explanation for why we behave as we do, we can find that explanation completely in the physical world and its physical properties. I can say that I moved my arm because I decided to move my arm, and according to the epiphenomenalist, the mental event that is my decision is an actual real thing that exists or occurred. But the actual causal explanation for why I move my arm simply traces back to neurons firing in my brain. Those neural firings may have given rise to the mental phenomena of a decision, but that decision didn't do anything. It's just there for us to observe, so to speak. All the causal work was done by the neurons. The nice thing about epiphenomenalism is that it too avoids the objections that plague identity theory. It doesn't suggest that the brain and mind are one and the same thing, and so it doesn't have to account for how they can have different properties. Of course they have different properties, says the epiphenomenalist. They're different things. It also doesn't have to try to get around the problem of downwards causation. Since it doesn't suggest that the mental causes anything, it doesn't have to explain how it does so. It might even align with those neuroscientific experiments we discussed a few lectures ago that suggested conscious decisions are just an afterthought, that the unconscious parts of the brain are what do all the deciding for us. But of course, the objection to epiphenomenalism is obvious. The idea that mental phenomena have causal efficacy, that my mind does things, is almost universally accepted. The reason I do philosophy is because I decided to. And the reason I decided to was because I enjoy it and want to have true beliefs, all mental phenomena. I'm overprotective of my son because I love him, another mental phenomena. I avoid going outside because I believe it is raining. These all suggest that mental events or occurrences, decisions, enjoyment, wants, beliefs, and love are all the cause of our behavior. So epiphenomenalism runs counter to one of our most basic intuitions. What's more, it seems that if the mental doesn't cause anything, well, then the world would not be any different if the mental didn't exist. So you're telling me, Mr. Epiphenomenalist, that since hate is an emotion and emotions are mental, and the mental doesn't do anything, that hate never caused anything in the world? So if you subtracted all the hate from the world's history, there would still be wars? If the mental really doesn't do anything, that would seem to be the case. But that's a pretty hard line to defend. It would seem that if there were no hate, there would be no war, or at least a lot less of it. But epiphenomenalists are not ready to go down without a fight. They suggest that the intuition that the mental has causal efficacy is rooted in logically fallacious reasoning. The reason we assume that mental events like decisions cause our behavior is because the mental events are always correlated with our behavior. But, as we have discussed many times, correlation does not entail causation. Correlation could be, for example, due to a third factor. And this, says the epiphenomenalist, is why our behavior and mentality are correlated, because they are both brought about by our brain activity. The reason that my decision to raise my arm happens at the same time as my arm raising is not because my decision caused my arm to rise. It's because a certain event happened in my brain, and that event caused my arm to rise, but also gave rise to the mental event of deciding to raise my arm. The mental event didn't actually do anything, it just seemed to because of the correlation. What's more, epiphenomenalists insist, even though mental activity, like hate, doesn't cause anything, it's still the case that if we were to retract hate from the world, if there were no more hate, there would be much less war, or no wars at all. This is because, they say, even though mentality like hate doesn't cause anything, it is necessarily correlated with certain kind of brain events that do. War is caused by brain events that cause people to act in certain ways. But those brain events necessarily give rise to mental events like hate. The only way there could be no hate in the world is if there were no such brain events in the world. But if there were no such brain events, then all of the world that such brain events caused would never have happened. The reason those brain events necessarily give rise to mental events like hate, epiphenomenalists suggest, is because the relationship that exists between the mind and brain is supervenient. A supervenient relationship holds between two things, say M and B, when no change in one, M, is possible without a change in the other, B. The mind supervenes on the brain because no changes in mentality is possible unless there is some change in the brain. The mind is a supervenient property. The way that supervenience was explained to me as an undergrad was through a mosaic poster I had in my dorm room. Individual frames of the Star Wars trilogy came together to form an image of Darth Vader. The Darth Vader on my poster is an emergent, supervenient property. He's emergent because the individual frames do not look like the whole. The whole has a property that the parts lack. But Darth supervenes on the whole because it's not possible to affect a change in Darth without in some way changing the pictures from which he emerges. We could change the pictures without changing Darth, say by exchanging them with other similar frames that have a similar color scheme. But because Darth is a supervenient property, you can't have the frames arranged as such without having Darth. If you were to buy a poster of the same frames arranged in the same way, it would make no sense to worry about whether it would really look like Darth Vader or not. You can't have one without the other. The only way to subtract Darth would be to change the frames. In the same way, you can't subtract the mental without changing the brain. This is why it's wrong to suggest that epiphenomenalism entails that subtracting mentality from the world would not change the world at all, since mentality doesn't cause anything. Since there is a supervenient relationship between the mind and brain, according to the epiphenomenalists, if there were no hate, the kind of brain events that give rise to hate would not exist. And without those brain events, the history of the world would be completely different. Of course, the idea that the mental does not cause anything is still very difficult to embrace. That's a hard bullet to bite. But some philosophers suggest that epiphenomenalism does not go far enough. These philosophers, like Paul and Patricia Churchland, are called eliminative materialists. And they suggest not only that the mind doesn't cause anything, but that the mind doesn't exist at all. Now, this may seem ridiculous, but as philosophical hypotheses go, it has a lot going for it. For one, it explains the difficulties we've been having. Recall those who were nominalists about persons. They suggested that the reason that we were unable to account for personhood, or what preserves personal identity over time, was this: personhood is a fiction. Persons don't really exist. It's merely a concept through which the world is organized. Well, eliminative materialist suggests that this is why we can't make sense of what the mind is, because it's a fiction. It doesn't exist. But not only do eliminative materialists suggest that the mind doesn't exist, they also suggest that mental words should, and in fact will, be eliminated from our vocabulary. This is unlike those who were nominalists about persons. Recall, they didn't think that the words self or person were meaningless or shouldn't be used. It's just that there are two kinds of speech, right? Conventional speech and ultimate speech. Conventional speech, although inaccurate, can be used to help us make sense of the world. Ultimately, they said persons don't exist, but it's not wrong or improper to conventionally speak as if they do. Eliminative materialists, however, suggest that talk of minds should be eliminated from our vocabulary entirely. As an example for why you might think this is the case, think back to the time when people thought demons caused disease. Now, as we advanced, we realized that it was in fact viruses and bacteria. But no one suggested that somehow the demon explanation and the virus-bacteria explanations were compatible. No one was an identity theorist about demons, suggesting that demons actually are identical to viruses and bacteria. No one suggested that viruses have demonic properties in addition to their physical properties. No one suggested that demons really do exist, it's just that they don't cause anything. No, we eliminated demons from our vocabulary and concluded that they didn't exist and never did. All the causal work is done by viruses and bacteria, so that's all we talk about when we talk about disease. Eliminative materialists suggest that we should do the same thing with the mind. We used to think our actions were caused by mental activity, but neuroscience has revealed that it is actually the activity of our brain that causes such things. Consequently, we should no longer talk as if minds really do exist. Instead, we should admit that all that really exists is the brain and, of course, the world in which it operates. Philosophically, this hypothesis is quite strong. It's certainly the simplest among the available alternatives, for it avoids suggesting that there are two substances, a physical substance and a non-physical one. It doesn't even suggest that there is a mind and a brain. All that exists is the brain. What's more, it doesn't have to account for downward causation or explain the qualia of mental experiences. In fact, we might even construct an argument in favor of eliminative materialism given these strengths. Here's how that argument would go. If minds exist, they are either separable from the brain, or they're identical to the brain, or somehow a byproduct of the brain. But as neuroscience has shown us, minds are not separable from the brain. This is why the soul hypothesis fails. But neither are minds identical to the brain because each has properties that the other lacks. This is why identity theory failed. But it's also impossible to account for how the mind could be a byproduct of the brain. It would have to be a completely unique thing, a non-reductive emergent property, which can only be trivially explained by appealing to ad hoc brute facts and fundamental laws. If the mind can exist only if it is separable from, identical to, or a byproduct of the brain, and it can be none of those things, well, then it must not exist at all. But it probably goes without saying that eliminative materialism faces some serious objections. Not only does it endorse the highly unintuitive notion that the mind does not exist, which we will address momentarily, but it also makes suggestions for how language should be used, and indeed the way it will be used. Eliminative materialists actually predict that eventually the mental will be eliminated from our vocabulary. But this is a very hard pill to swallow. For one, humans are notoriously bad at trying to predict the future, so who knows if this is really going to happen. Secondly, it would seem very unlikely that we would ever eliminate the mental from our vocabulary. It's just too convenient. It seems to be the way that we are programmed to talk about ourselves and our actions. Nevertheless, it still seems that eliminative materialism would be easier to swallow if it allowed us to use mental speech simply in the conventional non-ultimate way, a way that doesn't commit us ontologically to the existence of minds. Maybe it could even find a way to make use of a Kant-like noumenal-phenomenal distinction. Perhaps a revised eliminative materialism could suggest that the noumenal world contains no minds, but that the phenomenal world does. But the most obvious objection to eliminative materialism is the observation that, indeed, minds do exist. Eliminative materialists seem to be denying something that is obvious to everyone, that they have a mind. In fact, some have argued that even if we don't know anything else, we at least know that we have minds. Recall the skeptical problem and how Descartes concluded that, although he could doubt the existence of the material world, he could not doubt the existence of his own mind. For doubting itself is a mental activity that can occur only if a mind exists. What I seem to know, if I don't know anything else, is that I have a mind. And yet eliminative materialists are denying this. Now, in defense of eliminative materialism on this point, we might say this. We discussed in the first few lectures how our perceptions often lead us astray. We think we see things a certain way when in fact they are not that way at all. For simplicity's sake, think of your favorite optical illusion. But our perceptions are not the only thing that lead us astray. Our intuitions and introspection also are not nearly as reliable as people think they are. People think they're in love when they're not. People say they aren't superstitious, but carry around lucky charms. More importantly, it seems undoubtable that we have free will and that indeed we are a self or a person. And yet we've already seen convincing philosophical arguments against these notions. It may be that free will and self are merely illusions generated by the brain's own perception of itself. Likewise, it may be that the existence of the mind is yet another one of these illusions, something the brain convinces itself is true, but that is not actually the case. It may be that the existence of minds is nothing more than what philosopher William Ramsay, explaining the works of George Ray in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, called a remnant of misguided Cartesian intuitions. Okay, we've been exploring the nature of the mind, and we now have explored all the major theories: substance dualism, identity theory, property dualism, epiphenomenalism, and eliminative materialism. I've tried to point out the problems with each and refrain from endorsing one over the others. This means that we still don't have an answer to our question about the nature of the mind. Remember, though, that such is the nature of philosophy. Exploring the big questions of philosophy does not guarantee that we will find answers to those questions. Philosophy is the exploration of these questions, and wisdom is gained in understanding the questions, their potential answers, and their difficulties. Philosophy is not necessarily about finding answers, and when philosophers do find answers to philosophical questions, often those answers are so important that they spawn a new branch and branch off into a new discipline. Indeed, many have argued that philosophy of mind is simply collapsing into neuroscience. Perhaps eventually something like epiphenomenalism, identity theory, or even eliminative materialism will be the accepted view, and all other questions about the brain-mind will be answered empirically by studying the brain. Assuming we are not still willing to accept the non-existence of the mental, as I imagine most of you are not, even with the satisfactory answer of the nature of the mind, we're again left with the hard problem of consciousness. Whatever the mental is, how is it that the brain produces it? And even if we're satisfied by embracing a fundamental law that says it simply does, we're still left to wonder, what certain kind of way must the brain be configured to give rise to mentality? Perhaps this is a question that an array of scientists looking at the activity of the brain will eventually answer. But where would they even begin looking? How could they figure out what parts or pathways in the brain give rise to certain mental phenomena? The answer to this question leads us to the topic of the next lecture, functionalism. The idea is that we can identify which parts of the brain produce each kind of mentality by looking at how they function, looking at what kind of behavior they produce given certain stimuli. And this will give rise to a whole set of new questions. If something else, like a computer, could function in the same way that a brain can, should it be said to be minded as well? So could machines one day think? It is these questions that we shall consider next lecture.